Hey.
How's it going?
Good? You preaching or not preaching?
I think we're going to do this together this morning.
Okay. Can we sing first?
We can absolutely sing first.
Okay. You going to sing first?
No, you're going to sing first.
Love and marriage, fit together like a horse and carriage.
Well, they know the words. He only knows a few words.
I'm not very good with words. I don't know parts.
We got a few songs here. Have I told you lately that I love you? Okay.
When a man loves a woman.
From this moment, I have been blessed. I will love you. I promise you this.
And I only have eyes for you.
Okay, Isn't she lovely? Isn't she wonderful? Okay.
I was supposed to sing that, but I couldn't remember the tune, so I made her sing that. Well, there's a lot of songs and quotes about marriage, and with Valentine's Day coming up in a few weeks, we thought, it might be nice to talk a little bit about marriage. And we realized that a lot of our married couples are absent today, but we have some here today, so we're going to talk about marriage. But if you're here, you may be married one day. You may know people who are married, so this is good for everybody. But we're going to talk about love and marriage. And while its appearance may change and society may distort its purpose, and while there are many marriages that are failing today, the institution of marriage is in itself everlasting. And it plays a very prominent role in Genesis, and it shows up in Revelation as a classic example of the relationship between Christ and His church. And today, it is still relevant.
Absolutely. And not only is it relevant, it's imperative that we discuss marriage within the lines of Christianity. What did God really expect when He put Adam and Eve together? How are women and men supposed to relate to each other as husband and wife? And is this man really going to try to talk about wives submitting to their husbands?
No, I'm not. But she is. I will handle the husband's part. But we're going to show you how Ephesians 5:22 and the verses that surround it are probably a little more liberating for women than you realized. We're going to take a look at really a larger context, because you can't just look at a few verses here and there and be satisfied. It's all about context. And what we read this morning from Ephesians 21 through 30, you actually have to go all the way back to Ephesians 5:15 to get the beginning of this whole segment, go all the way through chapter 6, verse 9 to get to the end of this larger section that is known as the house codes.
Before we go, we forgot. We need to dismiss the junior soldiers.
I always
We did that. I'm sorry, guys. Bye-bye, junior soldiers. Have a lovely time.
Y'all don't care about marriage, just
Go. But you need to know. Love. It's all about love.
Here's what marriage is all about: lovingly correcting your husband in public. All right, so we're looking at house codes. And house codes start, as I said, Ephesians 5:15 through Ephesians 6:9. And house codes deal with the relationships within a house. And so we're going to look at marriage, we're going to look at parenting, and we're even going to look, because slaves lived in the home, we're going to look just very briefly at the relationship between masters and slaves. It's all in there. And most of what we talk about today will apply to each of those categories, but our main focus today is submission, and specifically mutual submission. And what Paul was really trying to communicate to the Ephesians and how that affects us today. And so, like I said, you have to go all the way back to Ephesians 5, verse 15. And the structure here is very interesting. If you're one of those that ever wants to go back and look at the original language, it makes a little more sense structurally. Some of the English translations struggle to get to the same form. But Paul is asking us to do a few things here. He gives us 3 things that we should not do and 3 things that we should do. He says, don't be unwise, don't be foolish, and don't get drunk. And then instead, he says this: be wise, understand the Lord's will, and be filled with the Spirit. And then following that, we get, in the original Greek, what appear to be participles, and participles are words that end in ing. And don't think I'm that much smarter, I had to look it up myself. But words that end in ing that reflect how to be filled with the Spirit. And so we get speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing, making music, giving thanks, and then submitting to each other in fear of Christ. And so these 5 things point to life filled with the Spirit. And the first 4 make a lot of sense. Talking and singing and giving thanks and making music, we get that, but this submitting thing is a little bit different. That can be a tough one for us. So how do you submit in a society that is built almost entirely on levels of authority? And we also need to notice that this command is to all, not just to the wives.
I don't know very many women. It's been abused a lot. People have used it in the wrong way. So women don't really necessarily like to read 5:22. But our intent today is to get you to a point where you really understand and appreciate its message. We're not just speaking to married couples. It's important for them as well, but it's also important for those of you who aren't married. If you're young and single and one day you might be married, if you have been married and aren't anymore, or if you have married children, you may have married friends. It's important information for everyone to understand how this works. Now, ladies, I've cringed a few times when I've had people read this verse to me and say some not so nice things, and you probably have too. But your thoughts on this passage might change when you understand what the role of a woman was in that time period. Excuse me, I've lost my voice. Prior to Christianity, women had a different role. Based on the historical documents that we read from that time period, we know that women were viewed and treated very differently than they are today. The simple fact that women are mentioned so rarely in ancient texts gives us some insight to what their status was in society. It wasn't very high. While women in certain parts of the world had more rights than others, we know of cases where women lived separately, completely separately from men, not even eating together. And women were to avoid the doorway of their homes so they wouldn't be seen in public. They were minimally educated. They were not recognized in the courts. They couldn't own property. They couldn't go into any kind of contract with anybody. And it's documented in the writings of Josephus that women were inferior to men in all ways. A Jewish rabbi of the time period wrote, "Do not talk much with a woman, not even one's wife." Let that sink in for just a minute. That's the lifestyle in which women had to deal with in this time period. So to see the Christian church allowing women to mingle with men in worship, allowing women to eat together with men, it's a grand departure from the times, to the point that it was considered completely scandalous. So that's one of the many reasons that the Christian church, early Christian church, saw persecution because of their treatment of women.
And while you could say that men were privileged at that time, it's still important to understand that Paul's message was also a departure for them from what they were used to and what they expected in life. You'd be very hard-pressed to find any ancient manuscript or historical document outside of the Bible that commands a husband to love his wife. And it's easy to misinterpret this passage, and it has been misinterpreted and misused many times. The media loves us and loves to misrepresent us from time to time, but they struggle to really understand Christianity, and they struggle to understand this. And so when the Southern Baptist Convention in 1998 changed their Articles of Faith to say that wives need to graciously submit to the servant leadership of their husbands, they had a heyday with that. And Newsweek ran a cartoon that had these cavemen, and one comes by with a club on one shoulder dragging his wife by the hair, and 2 guys watching him go by look at him and go, "Huh, must be a Southern Baptist." But what Newsweek failed to mention is the 2 sentences that preceded that in their Articles of Faith. And it says this: "A husband is to love his wife as Christ loved the church. He has the God-given responsibility to provide for, to protect, and to lead his family." The fact is that Paul in Ephesians spends twice as much time instructing the husband as he does the wife.
So one of the problems that comes up, and I don't know why we do this, but it's always boys against girls. You know, who is the better? And that's something that we have to struggle with here. And it's so sad that in Christianity this is a problem. And there are 2 main camps, 2 big camps here that deal with this. And they're big words, and I've murdered the word several times, so I'm going to try not to do it this morning. Egalitarians believe that men and women are equal in every way, that there is no distinction between the two. They will allow women preachers, which I think is a good thing. And some will will to also tell you that there is nothing wrong with the woman being the head of the household and the husband taking a subservient role. The other camp is complementarianism. And these are the ones who would freak out if they knew that I was up here on the stage preaching to you this morning. They are not necessarily bad, though. I mean, they have, they believe that women and men are differently. This is what they say in their slogan. It says, celebrating God's glorious design for men and women. They recognize that men and women aren't identical. Both groups are probably along the extremes. And the Salvation Army definitely does not go to either end. We follow somewhere in the middle, probably towards the egalitarian side more than the others. But even though we're different, and we know men and women are different, what we can agree on is that in the sight of God, we are equal. He has created us, all of us, in His image. And when He decided to create woman, this is what He said in Genesis. It says, "It's not good for man to be alone. I will create a suitable helper for him." Now, what I want you to understand is the word helper there. It is found 21 times in the Old Testament, okay? And 15 of those 21 times, it's talking about God Himself as His helper for mankind. So ladies, I hope that gives you an idea of how God used you.
Amen.
All that to say, yes, wives, we need to submit to our husbands. But what does that really mean? Well, it has to do with obedience, and it has to do with following His leadership. But just saying, submit, woman, doesn't work. And I do not recommend any husband try that in any way, shape, or form. It needs to be coupled with the verses behind it by 5:22. We really know that it's all about mutual submission. It's all about love. If you love your husband, you will submit to him. In the grand scheme of things, yes, my husband is the head of our household. And when we make a decision and we cannot agree on it, and we, exhaust our efforts, we have both decided as a couple that I will submit to his decision. And I will tell you this, that in 11 years of marriage, I've only had to do this twice. So it's not that he's ruling over me. He listens to me, and I appreciate that. But a better way to look at this would be on the focus on love and how Jesus expressed love. During a particularly tough time in our marriage, we read a book called His Needs, Her Needs, and it's by Willard Harley. And if you haven't read it as a couple, I really suggest that you do. It's a wonderful book. The premise of the book is that if you love someone and you want them to love you, you will meet their needs. And you will do so before you meet your own needs. Christ died for us while we were still sinners. Okay? He didn't wait for us to change. He didn't wait for us to find out what was wrong with us. Part of submission is showing love and meeting the needs and not waiting to see an expression of love from your spouse. One of the most loving things you can do for your husband, ladies, is to figure out what his needs are and meet them before he realizes that it's needed.
And because it's called mutual submission, guys, you are called to do the same for your wife. But for us, there is even more responsibility. Our primary responsibility is to be the spiritual leader in the family. And all too often, the husband becomes too busy with work, or too lazy, or lacks the spiritual maturity to take charge, and the woman becomes the default spiritual leader in the family. As men, we must boldly stand up as the real leader, not because we want to rule over our families, but because our wives yearn for that spiritual leadership in the home. It's not her responsibility. And it's not just her. If you have kids, they need someone to look up to as well. Their mother provides certain examples, but men are called to be the example of spiritual leadership. Now, I had a friend of mine in college that he dabbled in artwork, and he sketched this thing one time, and I asked him about it. But it was this great example of kind of how men and women work together, and how the strengths and weaknesses of each kind of work together. So I got to put this up here to show you. But what he did is he took his hand and he said, this is me, and these are my strengths, and these are my weaknesses down here, and this is my wife. I guess they were dating at the time, so my girlfriend. But these are her strengths, and these are her weaknesses down here. When they came together, they worked together to become stronger. And he was stronger, she was weak, and she was stronger, he was weak. And it was just a beautiful picture of how men and women are supposed to work together and complement each other and strengthen each other. But even for men, this isn't really quite enough, because Paul refers directly to a sacrificial love when he talks about how we are to love our wives. And there's no better example of love than Christ. And as he gave himself up for the church, we are to give ourselves up for our wives. And this is, at times, going to mean sacrificing hobbies and games or sports or work to meet the needs of our wives. But if you truly love your wife, then this sacrifice is totally worth it. Just as Christ's sacrifice for us was totally worth it. And the loving wife will appreciate your sacrifice, and she will meet your needs as well. It's a two-way road that we call mutual submission. So while we're doing a lot of talking about who is the head and who is the leader and who is submitting and who's making sacrifices, it all comes down to love. What does love look like inside of a marriage?
Okay. It should look something like this. Patrick loves me, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I love him. And because I love him, I want to support him in all he does. I want to encourage him in the choices he makes. Now, that doesn't mean that if he's made a decision I don't agree with, that I'm not going to tell him. It's in how I tell him. And I want to let him know that if he makes a decision that I think is good, it's important for me to tell him that. And that he knows that I think he makes good choices. I encourage our boys to pray with their father and for their father. And I want Gavin and Colin to know that I love their daddy. So I do the best I can through both words and actions to make sure that my husband knows that I love him.
She loves me, and I love her. And because I love her, I need to treat her as I want to be treated. In fact, I should really treat her better than I want to be treated myself. She deserves it. I need to lead boldly, lifting and holding her up when she needs it. I need to be willing to fight for her love even when she's mad at me, which means meeting her needs. I have to know her well enough that I know what her needs are without her telling me. I still do this. What I really need, I need to know her well enough that I know what her needs are before she even knows what they are. And I need to meet those needs. And I have to be willing to make sacrifices in my life so that I can meet those needs. And I'm not perfect at this. It's always a work in progress. But I'm doing what I can to show my love to her. And because I'm doing my best to show my love to her, she does her best to show her love for me.
All right. This is going to be somewhat audience participation, this part of it. If you are married and your spouse is here, we'd like for you to move so you're next to your spouse already. And if we're going to talk just to the married couples for just a moment, I'm not going to ask you to stand because that can be embarrassing. What I'm going to do, though, is I want you to turn to each other and talk to each other. We'll have a time of it. We'll have time here, but just for this brief moment, we're going to speak just to the married couples.
Or the serious couples. You guys can do this too. We're going to ask you to face each other. So go ahead and face each other. We're going to ask you to say some things to each other. So maybe your marriage is doing great. Maybe your marriage is struggling right now. We're going to ask you to face each other. Anyway.
And this isn't always a good idea. If you go home and you talk to your spouse, it's a good idea to say these things to one another from time to time. Oh, it's my turn. We're going to begin with the wives. So wives, I'm going to ask that you would repeat after me. You can take your husband's hand, and you're going to say, I love you. I want to support you in everything you do. I want to follow your leadership. And I want to obey and cherish you all the days of my life.
Husbands, please repeat after me. I love you. I want to be the leader God has called me to be for you. I want to show you my love by making sacrifices and meeting your needs. I want to cherish and serve you all the days of my life. Husbands, you may kiss your brother. And what God has joined together, let no man put asunder.
Amen.